Noubar Afeyan, it's a great pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining me on Mindful Leaders.
It's my pleasure.
So, you don't need an introduction, but for the record and for our audience, I'd like to say that you're a person who wears many hats. You're chairperson and founder of Flagship Pioneering. You are a biochemical engineer, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist. But basically, as a spin-off of Moderna, of Flagship, you actually co-founded Moderna, which is actually the famous company known for addressing the global COVID-19 through its vaccines. But apart from Moderna, you also founded and co-founded, I think, more than 70 startups in technology and in life sciences. You hold a great number of patents. You have received great awards. You are a lecturer at Harvard University, and you've co-founded numerous different social development initiatives, and the list goes on and on. So one of the initiatives I want to start off with is the Aurora Prize for Awakening Humanity, which was founded in 2015, and this year will mark its 8th anniversary. Basically, in a nutshell, this initiative celebrates heroes who selflessly show that the force for good can counteract the evil that people do to each other. Tell me, in these past few years, what achievements and results you've seen with the initiative, and how do you see its future?
Well, first, thanks for the kind introduction. As I listen to these introductions, I'm reminded that when I first came to the States, to Canada at first, there was a television program, a well-known soap opera called Young and the Restless.
Yep.
And I used to always think, well, that's interesting words. Now I feel like Old and the Restless. So
oh no,
that's kind of the only way to do these many different things and experiment is just to do it for a long time. So to your question about Aurora, so Aurora was born out of a void we felt in 2014, coming up to the centennial of the Armenian genocide, as to what we do as Armenian descendants of survivors. And of course, we had the same instincts as everybody else, which was, commemorate the loss, kind of celebrate the resurgence of Armenians. But that was it. And what we found was that there was something missing in all of that. And the basic kind of insight was that at the same time as criminals committed a crime against the victims, which a lot has been said about, saviors stepped in and saved the lives of survivors. And in the Armenian genocide, that's been a lot less covered, except for a few individuals, than in the Holocaust, where that's been a very important theme of the humanity that steps in when the humanity is completely turned against itself. And we wanted to bring attention to that because we thought that's an undercovered thing. Now, we could have gone back and said, let's find 100 such heroes from 100 years ago. But of course, the only living people now are their great-grandchildren who may or may not even know that any of this happened. So instead, what we decided to do is say, you know what, the same spirit of saviors interrupting their world to help others survive is happening right now. It's just not happening to Armenians. We thought 8 years ago. Unfortunately, we're now thrust back into that mode. That we can come back to that. But we thought, why don't we just actually, as a gift in the memory of those who saved our ancestors' lives, give a gift to the world where we bring attention to the people doing it today. So the notion is they're walking in the same footsteps as the people we need to thank from a century ago. That was the general idea. It grew quite rapidly. Vartan Grigoryan, who's the very, very famous, unfortunately, recently passed away, hero, really, of all Armenians globally, brilliant, brilliant man who ran Carnegie Corporation and many other things. He was a big inspiration of ours, Ruben Vartanian, and the three of us started this thing. And it's taken on a life of its own. It's actually been a very interesting medium because at the time, there wasn't even the big refugee crisis in Europe, what happened right after. So between refugee crisis and war-driven survivor stories that we're hearing about, all of that made Aurora kind of fill a much bigger void than we thought because the world needed to meet these heroes, celebrate these heroes, support them financially in every other way. And so it's become quite an involved activity. We had initially thought of this as an 8-year journey because the Armenian genocide experience, we think, is 1915 to 1923. So we actually thought this year would be the 8th and final anniversary. In fact, we've decided to continue it, expand it globally. There's a lot more resources that we're beginning to pull together to support this. So it's been quite a journey and a learning journey for us, very much so.
Interesting. I'll touch upon the genocide and collective traumas a bit later, but I also want to just highlight that this month is Women's History Month. And so it's a time to highlight the contributions that women have made in society, both historically and contemporarily. And I can't help but think about the contribution that your great aunt Armenouhi has made on your own personal life, or your grandparents. Tell me, what is your earliest childhood memory of her and of your grandparents? What stories did they tell that you recall?
So my great aunt was quite an extraordinary person. I was born into this world, and within days essentially shared a room with her, and did so from that time all the way till I was 20, when I moved out to go to graduate school at MIT. And she was basically kind of the hero of my life by a long shot. I felt badly for my parents when I grew older, because there was no way I could have had a relationship with them, which was a warm and close one, given her presence in our lives. She was an extraordinary person. So she was born in 1893. So I was born in 1962, so she was already 70 years old at the time. And her life story, if I did the math right, her life story was, living in Turkey before the genocide, remembering very, very well what life was like in Adapazarı, which is a town outside of Istanbul, closest kind of area. And then her brothers were taken away, not once but twice, to be killed off in the genocide. The whole kind of witness of that era was kind of live for her. And then she was married, ironically, to a doctor, an Armenian doctor in the Ottoman military, who during the genocide had to save Turkish lives. Actually, during the time, help them from diseases and the like. At the time, they were committing these crimes, which you could imagine would have been a massive psychological trauma for him. They then moved to Greece, World War II. They did together. She was a nurse, performed thousands of cataract surgeries. So I have the experience growing up of a stream of literally Greeks, not Armenians, who would come and find her in Lebanon and find her in Montreal where we moved, and thank her for kind of saving their eyesight. This is kind of a weird. So when you consider that normal, anything I've done since is kind of quite small. It's true. She was a very actually petite lady. She was very short. Like I was, when I was already a teenager, it was kind of funny that we were, sharing a room, and I was this, a big person. But she really did tell us, she was very careful. She never bred hatred towards Turks to us at all. She told me a lot of stories which Armenians may have a hard time actually hearing, of the degree to which Armenians actually didn't realize what was happening to them, and actually were involved in the very government that was doing this to us, and literally delusional as to kind of the programs that they were getting ready to execute. So it was, people who lived at the time saw a very kind of interesting picture where they were so integrated in society that it was unfathomable for them that such a thing could happen. That nuance is a very different one than what we get told in simple textbooks, etc. So that was important to me. And then kind of for her to realize that you just have to kind of, what I can tell you what she did to me, which I've never said publicly, is that she basically said, we have to come back and we have to be what we used to be before the genocide, and you and your brothers, I have 2 other brothers, and everybody else has to just basically take that on to preserve the memory, just not to look back and say, oh, this is what we were and look at us now, but actually build back and give back and just kind of matter to the world. And that, when you're young, you don't actually process that, but it just kind of becomes like an instruction, just like religion is a bit of an instruction set. She had her own religion. She had her own belief system. She really, and so it's true. My oldest daughter, Armin is her name, is named after her. She's a really amazing personality.
So evidently she's influenced you greatly.
Huge, yeah.
Yeah. So you can thank her for who you are today, in a sense?
So. Okay. Yeah, very much so.
I actually make a parallel to Albert Bourla as well, the CEO and chairperson of Pfizer. And he too actually explains, he's the child of Holocaust survivors. His mother in Thessaloniki, Greece, was almost killed by a Nazi squad. And his mother also, as a survivor of Holocaust, taught him never to have revenge or feel remorse, and in fact to celebrate life and have that second chance. So I kind of see, also based on my research, a lot of these great corporate leaders who are descendants of trauma, and they really are a force for good, like yourself, like Albert, Kenneth Frazier, another example, the third African-American man that well known on Forbes, and former, I guess, current or former president of Merck, of Merck, yeah. So I look at this, but at the same time I see a great number of research positivistic objective statistical research that shows that basically descendants of large calamities and collective traumas are negatively impacted by the traumas of their forefathers, from PTSD, epigenetics. And I see people like you and Albert Bourla and Kenneth Frazier and all these other very different, contradicting, let's say, hypotheses or statistics or information. How is it some people would have detrimental effects from a trauma that took place 100, 150 years ago, whereas others actually take this as a force for good? How would you explain that?
Well, so first, both Albert and Ken are folks that I know quite well because we're in the same industry, and I admire the work they do. Of course, the other company in the case of the vaccines, the BioNTech, which is a German company, is run by a Turkish couple also who have a very interesting similar history, less about the persecution perhaps, but this kind of a root, kind of rooted in that region and the history that goes in, and then actually trying to do something in the world. There's an immigrant version of this. There's also the traumatized version. But to your question, look, I think that most negative things, most challenging things, either make people do the opposite or people succumb to it. And I think at some level, it's really a personal struggle as to whether you can use it for good. In my case, I wouldn't say that there's no version of where what I do, what I've done, and my mentality hasn't been influenced by that. In Lebanon, at 5 or 6 years old, starting at 5 or 6 years old, we used to go every April 24th to a stadium. I remember very well, put on T-shirts, protest T-shirts every single year. So imagine growing from 6 to 13 years old when I left Lebanon. Every single year we'd go put on these T-shirts, get banners, and pour ketchup on us, whatever it was they were doing, just to go to the Turkish embassy and protest in Beirut. If you do that year after year after year, and you hear these stories, etc., it affects you. On the other hand, the question is, are you carrying a cross for the good, or are you carrying a cross for the bad? And are you going, do you seek revenge? Do you seek... So some people obsess over achieving justice, which is very, very important. Justice is also a humanist value. And if you don't have justice, things will repeat. So I think that battle has been fought, especially in the diaspora, and to a large extent successfully. I worry that we as Armenians refuse to accept success, and so we keep trying to pretend this defeat. But here we are. The U.S. has now acknowledged it, and in time, everybody else will have to. But at the same time, what I think we haven't done is to say, what's our place in the world, and what does this trauma entitle us to show the world, give the world, teach the world, and serve as an example. And I think that is something that, as Armenians, we've been way too introverted, and that is something that I saw as an opportunity. Now, professionally, this has also impacted me, because if you're carrying trauma from that two generations ago, and then more importantly for me, the Civil War, the beginnings of which I lived through in Lebanon, and we saw those atrocities, and lots of people getting blown up and buildings getting blown up very close to where we lived. That also impacts you. So that also could depress you, or it could make you feel a little more daring in trying things that, how much worse can it be?
Can't lose more.
A civil war is so those experiences kind of like, I will say that later in my life I've thought about it. During my life I didn't realize what was influencing things, but definitely those experiences have shaped the degree to which I've become committed to try to do something useful out of these experiences.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's based on these experiences or if it's your upbringing or your parents or whoever, but I actually, even though I don't know you very well, I see you as a person who's very self-aware, who's courageous, and is a very big risk taker. I say this because I know a few tidbits of your life. I think about when you started your university studies, you actually chose a field in biochemical engineering, a field that wasn't popular, it wasn't probably yet evolved at that time. I recall you telling a story, I think it was that MIT sent you to a conference at NSF, National Science Foundation, and there, even though the conference may not have been very influential or very important, you sat down at lunch with a person you knew nothing of. You start talking about some kind of what entrepreneurship, instruments, and lo and behold, you find out that it's David Packard.
That's right.
From Hewlett Packard. And he actually inspires you to take your degree in biochemical engineering to the next level of entrepreneurship, and then you start, absorbing and trying to learn more about entrepreneurship. I mean, tell me what it takes for a person to be open to opportunities, to take risks. The values that you have in being so courageous and self-aware, are these innate? Are these things that you were taught? Or is it the childhood experience that actually enabled you to have all this? You touched upon the fact that these different war and trauma have helped you. But I'm just thinking, if I'm not a person that comes from this kind of a background, what does it take?
So, I mean, it's interesting, and as I said, I'll answer it in hindsight only because I don't know that as I was doing these things, I was thinking about it, contemporaneously.
And one doesn't.
Yeah. So I would say a couple of things. First of all, the fact that my life was interrupted in 1975, and we ended up, living in a place where I never really saw snow before, and all of a sudden, all year long, it was snow
in Montreal.
In Montreal, and had to be thrust into a different culture. That adaptation, I'd say, and this feeling of unrootedness that you feel when you every generation. My grandparents were in Turkey, my parents were in Bulgaria and were born in Bulgaria and Lebanon. We were born in Lebanon and then ended up in Canada and then the States. So this feeling of unrootedness, as sad as it may seem, is actually liberating, because you actually, and this is an important concept that I've learned since, is that you really begin to realize that you can put your roots anywhere you want. And pretty early on, I'd say I was drawn to dropping roots in the future, not in the past, and certainly not in the present. So in hindsight, I ended up going to the edges of the field that I did an undergraduate in, which was the advent of biology. Biotechnology was a brand new field in the early 80s. When I went to do a PhD, I was the first graduate of MIT in that field. So it was really a new area. And here's why I've kind of rationalized it since. I think that I realized I have no natural advantages, not being native, not speaking the language as well as others, not having parents who had means. It was just not. But the place where you have an advantage is where there's nobody else. And the frontiers of any field is a place that doesn't get occupied by comfortable natives. And so it lends itself to immigrants who have the experience of immigration and now have the mindset of immigration, which is go where you have a competitive advantage. The reason most immigrants who settle someplace do things other people don't want to do is because other people don't want to do them. And so they're alone doing them. There's less competition there. So I do think that experience drove me to edges, and then I stayed there. Now, science as a field is an edge-making field. You continue to create new frontiers, new edges to explore. And if you can get there sooner than others, not out of bravery, to be honest, I'm going to talk about risk in a second, but out of just a propensity. Sometimes when there are, like, people investigate, let's say, whatever crimes or whatever, they say, do you have the motives? Do you have the means? Do you have the opportunity? Well, I had the motive in that I wanted to excel. I had the means in that I was given a great education and I had access in North America to just about any opportunity. And I had the kind of wherewithal to take advantage of the opportunity. And the motive was just kind of trying to figure out where I had competitive advantage. And so that's, I think in hindsight, that's kind of how I ended up here. Entrepreneurship is also edge detection. It's also doing things that other people have not done. And the first decade of my career, I did this as a regular startup entrepreneur founder. And then I realized I could do this professionally. That's the part that was kind of an interesting advance, in that I thought, well, why do people do this sporadically? Why can't we do this in an institutional way? And for the last 23 years, we've built an institution that does this, so that other people who are like-minded, who are seeking not the thrill, by the way, not the risk, but actually the opportunity of creating impact. So you have a disproportionate opportunity to create impact at the frontiers than you do close to the safe zone around where you are today. And to that end, let me just mention about risk. So I've come to view this topic of risk a little bit differently than many people do, because I rather view it as uncertainty. When you're working on something that's never been done before, it's hard to talk about it as risk because you can't assign probability to it. Like in everything we work on, you can't say what's the probability of success because it's never been done before. So on what basis are you going to say here's the probability of success? In risk, you tend to diversify. You tend to take some low risk, some high risk, you make a bucket. People know how to deal with risk. Uncertainty people shun because there's a belief system that uncertainty means extreme risk. My life experience is that uncertainty does not mean extreme risk. Uncertainty means low risk, high risk, you just don't know. And if you're willing to reach out for uncertainty and then actually tame it, actually make it less uncertain, suddenly low-risk opportunities emerge that are not at all there if you just keep working on what already exists. Because again, my point about competition, I don't see what my competitive advantage, or at least I didn't in the last 36 years of my professional life, what my competitive advantage is in the here and now. But I had a competitive advantage in my willingness to exist in the future and tame that uncertainty. And I actually count on low-risk opportunities emerging from that, as opposed to, so in that regard, I'm actually lower risk, I'm a lower risk taker than people who work in the commodity zone of today. Right? Commodity meaning everybody's going after the same things. So when we started Aurora, just to your earlier question, we created something that nobody had ever done before. We had a $1 million annual prize, together with other things, that the winner gave away. So imagine taking a hero, saying, listen, 100,000 of this is for your work, 900,000 you now give away to 3 other organizations whose work you value. So we took somebody who all their lives has been asking for money and donations and made them a giver, not a receiver. Well, that, people say, well, how do you know it's going to work? How do you know it's going to? And the answer is we didn't. We didn't try to estimate, well, I got a 15% chance this might work. We just said, you know what? It's uncertain. We'll try it. We'll adjust. So I've learned a lot of things about how to persist in an uncertain environment. Adaptation is the only human attribute that allows you to do that. And all this, and by the way, surviving is a big part of how you succeed in the first instance. And the irony is that surviving is the experience from which my life, kind of is drawn, both earlier and then during my life. So, if you, at Flagship and many of our other settings, we talk a lot about survive to thrive. And those are very important concepts. Survive to thrive is what the startup does. Survive to thrive is what you have to do if you're going to work in the humanitarian field, and you name it, NGOs. So that duality is very much the life experience of Armenians.
Interesting, because I mean, in terms of risk, I also, you're right, maybe the term uncertainty, because I think if you start off with a project in the sciences, for instance, I'm just thinking way back when you started in this area, and you're going to have to go find investors, obviously, and you don't know who's going to invest. You don't have a product to give to them, to show to them that it's a final product for them to see. So there's no real risk because you have nothing to lose, but at the same time, it is a very uncertain field. So thank you for explaining that. But coming back now to the way you manage your corporations, you've co-founded so many different companies. You deal with, I'm thinking about shareholders and board, directors and senior management teams and executive teams. Given your experience, tell me what you think is the most important thing you've learned about leadership, and when you're selecting your senior management teams, what do you look for?
Well, I don't know that I have kind of a pithy, 2-3 points that I keep going back to, but I
Let's go to HBR and say, this is what we know.
Exactly. Well, so I think the one thing is, because we work in a particular field, and I don't mean by that biotechnology, but I mean by that creating first of their kind companies. That's what we do for a living. I think what it takes to succeed there is potentially different than what it takes to succeed in a large company or a small tech company, whatever. This is a very different thing. So I say what I find in the relationships with people works is that you first have to be highly destination oriented. So one thing I've learned for 20 years, I've implemented also in everything I've done in Armenia, is that most people argue over directions, and I'd rather argue over destinations. And the reason is because if we can agree on a destination, including if another person's imaginary destination is better than the one I had envisioned, then the directions become a little more, fit for purpose, and they're trying to get us there. They're means to an end. But if you just argue over directions, let's go this way, let's do this, let's do that, then every other direction is the enemy of that particular direction. And so it ends up being about personalities. It ends up being about who has more power, who it can make. So one thing I learned is this ability to toggle between where you want to end up if you're trying to do something transformative and how do we get there. Now, there's some people who are comfortable with that, and there's a lot of people who are not. And the reason they're not, and this is another kind of thing I've taken away from my life, is we as humans and our education system almost makes us less serious about the future, and we think this past and the present is where serious scholarly work happens. In fact, work on the future is almost considered some speculative activity. We're all taught you can't predict the future. It's true. And therefore, why bother with the future? And yet, unless we can agree on what future we want to build, you're wasting a lot of resources today because you're not going to get there. And even if you think about what do we do for the future for our kids, we give them an education. Often it's directionless. We then give them means, maybe they pick a field, they say, oh, become a doctor if you're Armenian, or become an engineer, whatever. But that's direction-based. But if you said, okay, here are a few destinations you may want to aspire to. So that is something else I learned. So the reason I say that is when we hire people, we need people who are willing to have an open mind and a propensity to envision that future. So that's one thing. The other thing I've learned, and I'm saying things that are probably less in management journals because the rest can be read, is about alignment. So one thing I learned is that if you're gonna work in a high uncertainty space, I liken it to you go to London, Paris, New York, you get a bunch of people, you fly them in the middle of a jungle where there's absolutely nobody, and nobody's ever been there, let's just say, you drop them in. It is like the survivor thing, right? Yeah. And you drop them in. Watch what they do. The first few days, they're going to keep their suits on. They're going to look for their house. They're going to look for normalcy. When there is no normalcy, they're in the middle of nowhere. But people are so stuck on how they live their lives and their assumptions and presumptions. It's very hard to take them out of that element. In startups, there is no house. But you hire people from non-startups to bring them in. So the question is, how can you function with that uncertainty? And at least for me, what's really important is alignment. Alignment is a higher standard. This is not the way the management literature thinks than trust. See, right. Most people think that trust...
Or psychological safety.
Right. I don't believe trust is the go-to skill. I think it's alignment. And the reason is that I think trust is the last thing I would use to stay aligned. So if I'm misaligned with people, because a snake showed up or a bomb showed up, and I'm in the middle of this kind of crisis, chaotic situation in what I'm describing, then I want to hang on to every tool I have to stay aligned, which means communicate, listen, exchange ideas, pick a direction and go so that you're not too diffuse. And if you don't have time to align, then just trust. But if you use trust, what I've found is people overestimate the aligning capabilities of trust. In fact, I would argue that trust causes misalignment. Because if I trust you and we're in a bunker together and I don't talk to you and I don't tell you somebody's coming from your direction, how's my trust in you actually helping?
But there's no trust there if I can't believe in you or can communicate with you.
No. But if there's trust, I would argue you're going to communicate less because you just rely on trust, right? You're good, I'm good, we're in the bunker, go. I'd rather, because you know what, excuse me, can we just make sure we know what we're doing? And oh, by the way, when we're under extreme attack, then trust is what takes over. So I'm not saying I don't believe in trust. What I'm saying is, to me, trust is not enough in extreme uncertainty. Trust is not enough. You have to align, which is you have to give more of yourself. You have to communicate. You have to listen, more importantly. And people tend not to do that. People in a command and control kind of management style, which happens in lots of large corporations, will be less focused on that. Alignment in a company setting, a large company setting, is setting goals, setting objectives, setting a budget, and executing, and then evaluating people. That's what's called alignment. That's like de facto alignment. I tell you what to do, and then you execute. Alignment in a startup setting is anything goes. You're adapting, right? How does a team adapt, right? Like, I can adapt, but how do I know how you're adapting? Answer, stay aligned. Exchange ideas, say, here's what I think, here's my new theory of the case. So anyway, that's just one of the things I've learned. So it's not, people are not comfortable often. Team sports teach you how to align. Very hard to play basketball. I played basketball a lot of my life. Very hard to play soccer. Very easy to play solo tennis if you're not aligned. You have nobody to align with. Maybe the referee, that's it.
You know, interesting that you say that, because there's so much literature about trust and not so much about alignment. So I think this concept, but I think it works a lot more if you're in the startup, obviously, environment, and that's what you need. So the context is really important as well.
But I should say it also works if you're seeking transformation. I think anything you want to transform, alignment becomes very important. Anything you want to reform or slightly adjust, you don't need that, because the basic rules of engagement are set and you're just living within them. So I think it's not just startups, it's any place where you really want to drive big change in a country. It's about alignment as far as I'm concerned.
Well, like, think about, even leadership on a larger scale. You see I see many leaders today that think about what they can achieve today. Right? You were talking about future, but it's not so much the future. I don't see them thinking so much about the collective for the future, for the tomorrow. It's mostly, let me see what I can get today and achieve that. And I find that there's a lack of healing in the community because of that. You know, when you're not thinking about tomorrow, let me see what I can get to, you know, get the votes, get the selection, people to like me, people to appreciate me. And I don't know, I feel that, you know, that's something that whether you're in a corporate or a political setting, that tomorrow vision is lacking. Do you agree?
I agree completely. It's been a big battle of mine because in everything we do, I try to drag the discussion towards the future, and everybody thinks that I'm somehow, you know, kind of attention deficit or I'm not. It's true. You know, we started, for example, in this country, a project called Armenia 2020 in 2001.
Yeah, right.
In 2001. And the reason was because, you know, with my partner, Ruben, at the time, both of us he was living in Russia, I was living in Boston, and we were trying to say, what can we do in this country? And we thought, how can we have any agency in this country if we have no idea what's possible? And we thought, let's use our entrepreneurial skills, first and foremost, to come up with an inventory of what our strengths and weaknesses are, what possible scenarios there are, not just economically, but socially, governance modes, etc. And everybody looked at us, go, why are you working on this? Just, we need money for bread.
Right.
And we were like, okay, but that's the current government's problem. The diaspora, I actually feel, over the years, is actually best suited to think about and build a future for the country because they're living in the country's future. If you're living in Paris, you're living in the hoped for Armenian future, or in Denmark, or in Australia. Why? You can give your version of the future. That's what I mean by destination. But if you can bring Los Angeles to Yerevan, people won't move. That's the mindset you need to have. But people absolutely cannot. To this day, 20 years of doing this later, people just say, well, what's the catch here? Why are you guys doing this? Why don't you instead give money and build a new school, build a new whatever? And it's incredible to me. It's the line about don't give them fish, teach them how to fish. That line has no place in a zone where people feel like, look, if I can complain live, I'll also do that. When we started Aurora, people said, why would you give money to non-Armenians? Yeah. Armenians need money.
I remember that.
It's like, why in the world can't you give money to non-Armenians and Armenians? At the end of the day, we're both Armenians and non-Armenians, meaning we're living in a world. Yeah. So if humanity sees Armenians as giving for a change, wow, that would be interesting. And people said, no, that money should go to this. And so they all became our bankers, like, you know, giving advice, where do you put your money? So look, I've experienced this for a long time. I hope I die thinking about the future as opposed to the present or the past?
Well, I think the more you talk about it, the more it'll you know, chip away. Yeah. It's like, you know, I tell my child to go brush his teeth, you know, every night, and I still have to tell him, don't forget to brush your teeth. But after a while, it kind of becomes automatic. He kind of gets it that, okay, I have to brush my teeth in the evening. You have to keep repeating it, and I guess it becomes a habit, and people will understand the concept of why that is. I just have a difficulty thinking about, you know, you and your co-founders have developed the Future Armenian with this intention to think about the future of Armenia as a nation. I'm just thinking, okay, great, that's wonderful, but the future without a healed community, without a united, healed community, especially given the accumulated traumas, atrocities that keep recurring and that is embedded in us. How do you actually think about the future if you're not even presently in that space?
It's a great challenge, and it's a good way to actually make this point, but in a different setting, which I haven't made in the form of your question. I'd ask the question in reverse. How could we possibly prioritize healing if we don't have some ambition about the future? Like, what are we healing for? The reason I would argue we're not healing is because we have no vision of a future. And so why are we healing? We just keep kind of wallowing in our sorrow and in our unfortunate kind of situation, and that's a psychological state in of itself. It's not a bad place to be. There's entire countries who kind of revel in their disadvantagedness, and we're kind of stuck in that mode. So I would argue the opposite. I would say that a vision of a future, not one person's vision, a common vision, a popular vision of a future, that means people have to accept it, is a motivation to make the sacrifices, to heal, to listen to each other, to reconcile, to enable. Without that, what's the goal? Persistence cannot be a goal. I mean, it is a goal in the majority of the world. Right. But so I actually think your point is a good one in that I think if you said, let's heal first and then plan the future, I would say, why are we healing? Yeah. Why are we healing? I mean, you might say, well, it's a normal human condition to want to heal. No, it's not. People are perfectly happy living in conflict with each other because there's the self and then there's the other. And most of us kind of feel good about criticizing the other. And the more different the other is from us, the easier it is to criticize.
Well, that's the will to power, right? You try to be divisive as much as possible and to show that this...
That's human nature. Yeah. And so what counteracts that, in my view, people collaborate if they have a common enemy. If the common enemy in this mode is building a future that's going to be tough to achieve, but then can be rewarding, so the common challenge, not enemy, that might unite us. But if you have no, like I said this for decades in diaspora, in Armenian diaspora, people are like, why are you talking about the future of Armenia? I said, because it could unite us. Like if the only thing that unites us is that we're going to complain about genocide recognition, that's going to drag us backwards. But if even the genocide recognition is a futuristic activity, because you're imagining a day when they've all accepted it and you're working towards that goal. Well, imagine if a bright Armenia, a sustainable, prosperous, fair, democratic, all the things we wish for at Armenia is the objective of any diasporan who has the means, whatever, the intellect, the education, then like you have done to move here, that to me unites us, heals us. So healing doesn't mean you sort everything out. Healing means you overlook a bunch of things. You overlook a bunch of things to an end. You don't overlook them if there's no end.
You acknowledge it. I wouldn't say you forget it. It's not
necessarily
you acknowledge it.
But you overlook it because you have a bigger goal. Right. So anyway, my point is actually, I don't know, I think we as humans, this is an important thing for at least in my life. We as humans are given many faculties intellectually. We don't think about it that way. Reasoning is the one that, in my view, is a muscle that we've overgrown. And education forces you to be a reasoning engine. Imagination is massively underdeveloped. And it's almost discouraged.
Are you talking about here in Armenia or in general?
In general. So I'm saying the more educated people get, the less imaginative they get. I'm excluding arts, but they really do. Even in arts, they become much more, the more knowledgeable you are, the less imaginative you have to be, is the trade-off people make. It's quite the difference. Imagination allows us to envision a future that's more desirable than our present, and then it gives us the motivation to make the sacrifices and the trade-offs of uniting and healing needed to get there.
I agree.
That's the thing I've learned, and that startups take imagination, entrepreneurship takes imagination, saving human lives takes imagination. Because you got to imagine that you're going to live after you've saved their lives. Like if you're going to die, that's becoming a hero, but so all of this to me are interesting cross currents that we experience.
Well, just to feed off on this point, education. Education and school systems teach us to memorize, to excel in certain areas. I don't know if in general they teach us to mend a broken heart, to deal with failure. I mean, I think of the late Sir Ken Robinson who says, schools kill creativity. And we don't even know what the job market is going to be like in the next 20 years. We know for certain that AI, machine learning, bioengineering will be changing, or it will be definite in changing the job market, but we don't know what it's going to look like. So how can today's education system, prepare us or the newer generations for the tomorrow in a way where we can be imaginative, creative, and compassionate?
Well, I think that among the biggest skills that education doesn't give us is the ability to be adaptive. And adaptivity works great in changing times, and is a resource only in not changing times. You don't get to use it very much because you got to conform. In a non-conforming world, which is the one we're in, where there's wars and inflation and hatred and inequity and you name it, adaptivity is the most important part of human resilience. Adaptivity takes a lot of knowledge, because the more knowledge you have, the more efficiently you can adapt, because you can begin to understand what's going on, as opposed to completely freaking out because you can't process it. But then adaptivity takes imagination and an ability to experiment. How we learn that in school and with which courses we learn that, I tell people, I'm involved in education in pretty significant ways because I'm on the board of MIT and I'm on the executive committee of MIT, which is one of the universities, good universities in the world. And there, it's interesting. You tell them, like, where are people experiencing failure? Like we judge people in school based on how right they are, and then they leave and they succeed based on how wrong they are, provided they take the wrong and they convert it into right by adapting. So adapting, tolerance, as you're saying, being able to work in a shared environment where you can actually agree on somebody else's vision and join it, as opposed to being right all the time. That being right tendency is very tricky. Now, in science, by the way, you're supposed to be open to being wrong, because the hypothesis-driven experimentation is supposed to be that you're trying to falsify your hypotheses. But boy, is that not how science is done these days. You're supposed to be right in what you hypothesize. You only publish things that succeed. You don't publish things that are wrong. Yeah. So I just think we've got a lot of growing up to do collectively.
Yeah. I have so many questions popping in my head, but I know that our time is limited. But so I have a couple of questions. One is one that's killing me to ask you, and that's biotechnology. Biotechnology has produced so many wonderful things for humanity, but a lot of people also argue, and I'm sure you've had to discuss this in different conferences. People argue that apart from nuclear war, apart from the climate crisis, that genetic engineering and AI are posing a danger, or an existential danger to humanity, because it will disrupt the current existing ecosystems, especially if biotechnology and the technologies there actually get in the wrong hands. Tell me briefly, I mean, it's not a brief answer you can give me, but what you think about this.
I think at any time that you live, any innovation is going to be usable for good and for bad. I think you'd have a very hard time pointing to any innovation, electricity, telephones, wireless, computers, that have not been the means by which somebody is given the order to blow something up, right, or to kill somebody, or to destroy economic value, you name it, right? So when people decided to make a run on crypto, it was a computer, ironically, that actually went after. So all of these things, and I think it's no different, and I think people sometimes think that this is the first era in which this is an issue, and humans have had to navigate that choice between good and evil. That choice is ancient, it's religious, it's the whole kind of human existence, is that you have a choice. And if you don't keep that balance, you pay a price, either societally or the whole world, if we get this wrong. That does not mean that you should avoid certain things, because the very same things save lives, extend lives, do all sorts of other things, as we saw in the vaccines. And to this day, people are swearing the vaccines are really, really bad for you, except maybe, to a very small number of people. They're entitled to their opinion, but that is not a science-based thing. That is a belief-based thing. And you can't, if you spend your time trying to disprove it, turns out you instead of avoiding as best you can the unintended consequences, and you have to be proactive. By the way, if you're going to be an inventor, you have to be proactive in putting safeguards in, and also talking about it to people and educating them. But beyond that, evil people will do evil things, and it's just not, in my view, practical to say let's not go there. There are places where one draws a line. For example, in gene editing, I think we have not had enough of a discussion as a scientific community to do germline editing. I believe that that's a discussion that will be had over decades. And if the technology gets to a point where the downside of such a thing, including its misuse in doing eugenics and the like, is more than offset by the upside of people's lives fundamentally changing, so they're no longer blind, so they're no longer destined to die when they're 5 years old, that to me becomes a human right fighting against a human right. Like, both of them are right. It's just a question of where do you put, as a society. That's not up to scientists to decide. That is and by the way, one of the things I've learned, I wish I knew it much earlier, is you cannot be an innovator and not be involved in public discussion. You cannot say, look, I don't understand these things, that's not my field, that's somebody else's field. The notion that ethicists should decide how science should be deployed, ethicists should be part of the discussion. But so should scientists, so should business people, so should government. And I think that's a better way to go. It's just discussion, consensus. And there again, I'll point out, a discussion about what the future might be, as dystopian or utopian as you might make it, is a very important tool, because you cannot agree about the present. But if you can draw some agreement about the future, climate's a very good example of this, right? If you can have, there's a lot of books written. There's one that I quite accidentally found, not too long ago, called Ministry of Future. And the reason is because we thought we had invented this concept of Ministry of the Future for
Future Affairs.
Future Affairs. And all of a sudden somebody told me, hey, there's a book called Ministry of Future, you should really read it. And it is a dystopian, very well written, in my view, book around the world after a climate crisis and where people have died and what the world's doing about it. Notice that's an easier place to talk about why we should do this than it is to say in 2024 we want 0.8% reduction in XYZ. And we go, why? Why can't they do this next year? I'm not going to do it. So it's another place where the future is a tool with which we can drive consensus.
Very interesting. I could go on about biotechnology. I'm very fascinated by it, but I actually want to end with a particular question that I always ask my guests, but in this way I will twist it a bit different. There was, in 2007, if I remember correctly, Harvard psychologists did a survey on millennials, and the question was, what is your #1 life goal? Right? And the #1 life goal, I think about 75% had answered that their life goal, the #1 goal is to be rich. And the second top answer was to be famous. And then obviously numbers changed over the years. They kept doing the survey. And now still #1 is want to be rich. #2 is up close to famous, is now having a successful career. But lately we see that people are having a quest for eudaimonic well-being, to live a psychologically rich life, to, really know what their purpose is, feel connected to what they do and have meaning in what they're doing with their community. They call it dharma. Tell me, what is, or have you known what your dharma or your calling or your purpose has been? And when did you know and how did you find out? And if you were to have a discussion with your 4 kids around the kitchen table about this topic, how would the discussion go?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I do have 4 kids, and they're all challenging towards their own lives as to what is motivating them, let alone us. And unfortunately, I haven't been asked this question by them, although I'm sure they all would like to know the answer to that. Disappointingly, I don't have a life goal. And I say disappointingly because every project I start, every company I start is very much driven by that. But it's not like I've sat around and said, what do I want to do when I'm 60, what I want to do when I'm 80, and kind of like work towards that. So here's my major failing is that I don't, just like doctors tell you, you should lose weight even though they're overweight. Saying, I have not applied this to my own life. On the other hand, I've lived, kind of as in debt, if you will. I've kind of felt like and I really have, as survivor, as descendants of survivors, as kind of part of a tribe that continues to be, quite unlikely to succeed in the way the world has kind of thrown us in this situation. That we have a job to do in the world, and that job gets easier the more connected we are with the world, the more people attribute expected value to us in any field, whether it's music or art or science or anything. The notion that Armenia has a better future and Armenians have a better future if we matter more, that is a call to arms for every single Armenian who's alive today. And that, in a form, is a motivation itself. Now, what does it mean to matter more? It's to have more impact. At the end of the day, in every field you're in, impact or expected future value is how people kind of relate to you. And expected future value is not financial value. It's just kind of like lives saved, lives impacted. Personally, I am happy that I was part of an organization that created a vaccine that's to date, by many measures, has saved over 2 million lives. That's a little more than the 1.5 million Armenians that were killed. And that matters to me. That doesn't mean, that's not why I did it. That's not a goal, no. But it's an impact. And there's many other impacts, economic impact we've had, jobs we've created, all of those things. So I would say that on both the professional and kind of philanthropic level, it's fulfilling. I'd say personally, I've, for the last 23 years, given myself a kind of an ambition to try to create an institution, an organization in Flagship Pioneering, my company, that invents a new way to invent breakthrough companies. And there has not been, to my knowledge, any systematic way to invent companies that make breakthroughs. And for 23 years, we've built such a thing, and we have probably at least the oldest institution now that does that, probably at the largest scale. We have 350 people that do this every day. The world believes that breakthrough innovations happen by chance through inspiring genius moments, and the world believes that great companies are created by fantastic entrepreneurs. We believe breakthrough innovations can be made systematically through process and through a repeatable evolutionary approach, which we use, and we believe that companies can be created by teams of people and that work in a systematic way. Those are both contrarian things. If it turns out that we can find a way to do that, that will also leave impact in that it will have created a new engine for impact, for value. So those are not answers to goals, right? Like, why does all this matter? But that's how I'd say orient what I'm doing.
But I mean, it's a matter of also having a sense of purpose. I mean, you can have a goal, like you say, your destination, but I may not necessarily be completely, what you say, aligned or emotionally attached to that. It's just basically a term of what society has conditioned me to think about what success means, because I'm listening to what society expects of me. Whereas in your case, it's something much more innate, much more spiritual, where you actually know that I actually feel alive when I'm doing this, regardless if I achieve, even if I don't make $1 million. I mean, I'm not an owner of Flagship Pioneering. I have my little, family life, family ecosystem. What kind of impact and how is that relatable? Yeah. This is, I think it matters. And people, when they discuss this topic, I think it's a matter of, there's a confusion because of what society has told us and what we really want to do. And that, especially the new generation is having that struggle to find their way, their voice, their place in the world. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the word spiritual, and I'll just mention just briefly, it is important, I think, that all these words cross, all these worlds cross. So for example, I have for many years kind of used the expression that comes from the Armenian ritual of baptism, which I think is extremely relevant in many other fields, which is, we say, what does the child want, which is faith, hope, love, and baptism. And in my view, that is an important instruction in many other settings than religion. Faith is about believing in the future that you envision and your ability to get there. Yeah. Hope is in making sure you get the resources, and because you can't get there on your own often, to actually be able to get there. If you don't have the hope, right, and you just operate on faith, you're going to get disappointed pretty quickly. So the hope puts the faith into action, is the way I look at it. Love is the surroundings that actually allow this to happen, and making a team in a company setting is a bit of an act of love. It's not, it's just, you don't think of it that way, but it really is, in that's where the trust and all these things come from, and just getting used to having shared mindsets, shared goals, and shared values. And then the baptism is an interesting thing, because that's kind of almost a rite of passage. It's like whenever you're talking about entering a new world order, a new kind of reality, religiously, baptism means entering Christianity. But so I actually think that there are these things that are more universal human values that can guide the way we think about what we do professionally. People they like to segment these things, and they think these are sacrosanct concepts. They're not. They're all the same thing.
Yeah. Noubar Afeyan, I don't know what to say. Every time I listen to you, any of the ideas that you have, you inspire me, you motivate me. Your life is just a beautiful journey of not just successes, but great lessons, failures as well that came with it. But to be where you are today, it's very impressive. I'm looking forward to seeing all the wonderful new endeavors and projects you're thinking about for the future. And I wish you nothing but success. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.